Parshas Matos. This week's share is being given Nishmas, my nephew Yצחק, Mordechai הכהן, Zal ben Rafal David הכהן Ner Yahrzeit on Friday, and Shomash Lavan Aliyah. You should be made it Yosef for the family. Now, I thought that since we're on the 3 weeks and we're moving closer to the 9 days, perhaps it would make sense to focus on the part of the Parsha that actually delivers a message which is very relevant to this particular period. So Parshas Matos begins with the Parsha of Nedorim and Shavuos. Literally the second posuk of the Sedra reads as follows: Ish ki yidor neder l'Hashem. Someone who makes a neder, a vow to Hashem, or yishov ha-shavua le'aser isal nafshe, or he makes a shavua. Either way, what he's doing is he's creating for himself something that's forbidden. He's imposing an obligation on himself which otherwise would not be there. The pasuk says lo yachel devoroi, which simply means he's not allowed to break his pledge. He's not allowed to transgress on what he has said, what he's committed to. Kachol hayotze mipiv yaseh. Anything that comes out of his mouth, he has to do. Okay? That's the words of the pasuk. And as I say, the parasha that it introduces is the whole masechta of Nedorim, and what to do when a person does make a neder, and how to get rid of them, and what to do when a wife makes a neder, etc. But Rashi, quoting the Sifri, on the words of the pasuk lo yachel devoroi, Rashi says kemoi lo yachel devoroi lo yaseh devoroi chulin. A person should not make their speech, their words, chulin. Now I'm translating chulin in this context as insignificant. In other words, from Rashi one sees, from Rashi from the Sifri, that there's a broader message that's being alluded to in this parasha, in this pasuk, which is essentially addressing the use of a person's speech. And the message is that we have a significant power of speech and one should use it carefully. So with such an opening, I thought it would be very beneficial to go through a shtickle of Rav Aaron Kotler in his Sefer Mishnas Rav Aaron, where Rav Aaron points out at least 7 different points about the power of speech, things that we should take into consideration, take note of, and as I say, especially relevant for this particular period where we are mourning the loss of the Beis HaMikdash. So the first point that Rav Aaron says is that you know why speech is so precious? Because it actually goes to the essence of what a human being actually is. And he explains it with, I think, what's called the famous Targum Onkelos. On the pasuk in the beginning, in the Bereshis Beis Zayin, where the pasuk describes HaKadosh Baruch Hu creating the first ever human being, Adam Harishon, and the pasuk says, "Vayipach ba'apov nishmas chaim." So HaKadosh Baruch Hu, as it were, breathed a neshama of life into Adam. Vayihi ha'Adam lenefesh chayo. Hey presto, Adam is born. But the words of the pasuk are that Adam became a nefesh chayo, which means a live human soul. The Targum translates these very words as leruach memalelo, which means the ability to speak. So the very definition of what it means to be a human being alive is the fact that we have the ability to speak. And Rashi clinches this by saying that the truth is behemoths and chayas can also be called nefesh chayo. They're also called live beings. But Adam is different because shani toisef boy deo v'dibor. Because a man is different, a human being is different, because we have intelligence and speech. And it's apparent from Rashi, especially if you take the view of the Targum, it's apparent from Rashi that these two go hand in hand. A person, anyone, an animal also makes noises. We can have a demonstration, right? We all know from kids and from being kids, we know what animals' noises sound like. So they also make a verbal expression of noise. And essentially, what does speaking mean already? It's just making noise in certain syllables that make sense to other human beings. Animals talk to each other as well in their language. So clearly what we're talking about when we say the ability to speak, we're not talking about the physical, biological ability to pronounce sounds from a person's mouth. What we're saying is the ability for a person to have intelligence that is apparent from their speech. So that's the first point Rav Aaron Kotler makes. Speech, the ability to speak, is something so special because it goes right to the essence of what it means to be a human being. The value of being a human being as opposed to an animal is that we have intelligence which is expressed through speech. The second point Rav Aaron Kotler makes is there's something more unique about a person's ability to speak. And it's not just, like we said, that a person is able to articulate that intelligence that we have as human beings. It's even more fundamental than that. So he brings from the Vilna Gaon. We know we have inside each of us, we have a guf and we have a neshama. That doesn't just mean we have a body and a soul. What it means is we have two opposite driving forces within every single person that pull him in different directions. The guf is the koyach within a person that has the materialistic side to the person. It's the part that leads us to fulfilling our physical needs and desires. Opposing that, we have a spiritual drive, one that's driven by the neshama. And that is where we're being pulled to doing spiritual things. So every human being, we know this is Dvarim Pshutim, every human being has two sides to them. But says the Vilna Gaon, as a result of having these two sides, we become the boicher, we become the chooser. We have free choice. We have free will, we have bechira. We can choose which way to go at any given moment. What part of a person are we engaging with when we make that choice? It's not the neshama, because the neshama is all spiritual. It's not the guf, because the guf is all materialistic. It's the ruach. So the Gaon, it's the ruach that's within us. And ruach, I would translate it as a moral spirit. The koyach that we use, that we engage with to choose, is the ruach. Says Rav Aaron Kotler from the Gaon, the very same ruach, the same koyach that we engage with in order to make choices is the very same koyach that we engage with to speak. Our ability to speak comes from the exact same koyach that we have within us to choose right from wrong, to choose ruchni versus gashmi. That's why the Targum, when translating the Hebrew and saying essentially ability to speak, he calls it ruach mamalalah. Because ruach refers to that part of us that makes choices, and it's the same ruach that enables us to speak. And that's why, says Rav Aaron Kotler, it is dafka through speech that one can truly grow to great heights. When a person uses his speech for Torah, for tefillah, for good things, he becomes propelled upwards, he becomes propelled forwards, because what he's engaging with is the very koyach habechira that we are in this world for. And likewise, unfortunately, if someone misuses their speech and uses speech for aveira, for negative things, it has a tremendous effect on the person. It is dafka, says Rav Aaron Kotler, through speech that one's life choices play out in real time. And the truth is that even to us laymen, we can often tell the character of a person from how they speak and from what they speak about. You can pick up quite quickly what the person's about, just from their speech. Which leads us directly to the next point that Rav Aaron Kotler makes, which is that an aveira that is done through speech is much more severe than any old aveira. Now, we're not in the business of comparing aveiras like for like, and we're not recommending one aveira over the other. But as a concept, says Rav Aaron Kotler, a chet that's done through speech is very chomo. And the truth is, you pick up any Sefer Chavetz Chaim, anywhere in Sefer Chofetz Chaim, read a couple of pages, you'll already see how the Chofetz Chaim articulates and expresses this truth, that speech, Averos through speech, cause many problems. And in fact, the Pasuk which the Chofetz Chaim is based on himself, Mi ha'isha Chofetz Chaim, nitzor l'shem chamira. If you want a good life, a long life, longevity, fulfillment, quality of life, you've got to guard your speech. Because that which is done through speech carries more weight. And we all know, of course, the famous Chazal, which is the primary reason why I chose to speak about this topic today, that Sinas Chinom caused the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, and the Chofetz Chaim and others point to the fact that it was Lashon Hara, really, at the core of Sinas Chinom, that fueled the Sinas Chinom. And the Gemara in Erichin, Daf Tesvav, goes in very hard on Lashon Hara, and I want to read you 3 of the Ma'amorim that are there on the Gemara. There's plenty more, you can have a look yourself, because I want to bring out this point, that it's really remarkable when you consider what the Gemara says about Lashon Hara over and above other Averos. The Gemara says 3 things. Anyone who talks Lashon Hara is as if they have been koifa in HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Boom. Second thing, Rav Chisda Marmoko says, anyone who speaks Lashon Hara, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, ein ani v'hu yicholim lo ba'olam. We can't live together in the same world. Now, some of you may be familiar with this terminology used to describe specifically a Baal Gaiva, a haughty person. It's machlokes in the Gemara, if it applies to Baal Gaiva or Baal Lashon Hara. Not a great thing to be either way. But the Rebbeinu Shalom says, I can't be in the same world as a guy who speaks Lashon Hara. And finally, what I'm going to quote to you from the Gemara, it's Torah Devi Shimon, Kol HaMasab Lashon Hara, Magdil Avonos Keneged Sholosh Averos Avodazora Kid Arayesh V'Chesdamim. It's as if, comparatively speaking, it's as if he's engaged with the 3 Averos Chamuros. Now, the Gemara is not into hyperbole. The Gemara is not giving a mutashmuz with a poetic license to lay it on thick because it'll make everyone scared. The Gemara is saying truth. And it's absolutely shocking. Because if you think about it, if I asked any Cheder Yingel, any schoolboy, tell me, what's the worst thing you can do in the Torah? Well, being koifa be'ikah is pretty much up there, right? The first one that says Adibras, you've got to believe in HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And then after that, it's the 3 Averos Chamuros. Everybody knows. Come on, they're the worst things to do, right? You're a person who should give up their life rather than being over the 3 Averos Chamuros. And the Gemara is saying Lashon Hara is worse than that, right? It really gives a person pause to thought about the enormity of Lashon Hara. But this isn't a talk about Lashon Hara, in as much as I just want to bring out the point that you see an Avera that's done with speech, how it carries so much more significance, so much more weight than another Avera that was. Just to wrap up this point about Lashon Hara, it's an interesting marriage I came across. It's Dvarim Rabbah, Hey Yud, that says the most explicitly that I saw of the Chazal. The Medrash says, Loma lo yibonu lehem beis hamikdash. Why is the Beis Hamikdash not been built yet? Shehoyu b'neim de lo toirin. Because there are people who speak Lashon Hara. Straight up. As I say, it's well known, but it's straight up Medrash. Lashon Hara is being spoken, Beis Hamikdash can't be built. So we all know and understand the significance of this point that Rav Aaron Kotler is making, which is that Averos that are done with speech are much more significant than not. Rav Aaron Kotler goes on. The way a person chooses to speak affects how he grows in personal development and how he grows in his midas. And he quotes a pasuk in Mishlei, Man lerach yoshiv chema. If a person answers softly to someone who's angry, he can dissipate the anger. Says Rav Aaron Kotler that this doesn't just mean when you're responding to someone else. Some guy comes over to you spitting fury and you're all very calm, that will dissipate his anger. It means the person himself within himself. The person's getting enraged, the person's getting upset, and yet they pull back and they talk softly, then that will enable the person to control his anger. I'm just remembering now that the Igeres Ramban also says the same point. The person should always make sure to speak softly. Why? Because then the person won't end up with midas rise as he continues. The idea is that it's the way you speak that affects your midas. He quotes from the Gaon. This is what I would call typical sharfkeit of the Gaon, but it's so beautiful. I want to say it out. It's really good. The Gaon in Pasuk and Mishlei Yud Gimel Gimel. Pasuk says, Noitze piv shomer nafshoy. He who guards his tongue preserves his life. Poisek sefosov mechita loy. If he opens his mouth wide, he opens his lips wide, talks a lot. Mechita loy, it will be to his ruin. That's what mechita is, that's not ruin. The Gaon says the following Lashon. Rav Aaron Kotler quotes him. Mi shemarchiv sfosov. Someone who opens his mouth. And obviously he means talking negatively, right? We're not talking about someone who opens his mouth, literally. Afal pi sheyesh loy nefesh toiva. Even if he has a good soul. V'oisa mitzvahs harbe. He does lots of mitzvahs. V'goder atzmoi bekamo gedorim. And he's set up for himself all types of gedorim, all types of fences to make sure and safeguards, make sure he doesn't do aviris. He's a heilige yid, like we might say. Lo yo'idu loy, says the Gaon. It won't help him. Usfosov tiyenu lo lemechita. His lips, his mouth, his speech will be for him his destruction, his downfall. It's absolutely phenomenal. It's mind-blowing. And for all the good things that a person tries to do, if a person doesn't take care of their speech, if they use their speech in a negative way, then they are, unfortunately, causing problems for themselves. And there's another aspect of this as well, which again speaks to the power of speech. Well, those of us who've learned Gemara will be familiar with the phrase, Dvarim shebalev einam dvarim. Anything that's just kept within the person, but not expressed, doesn't have any significance. Speaking, by articulating something, the act of speaking brings the matter into existence. And we have it all over the Torah. Think Kiddushin. It's only when spoken that there's a bond. Trumas Maisros. It has to be spoken in order for it to be chal. Kedushas Shabbos. You bring in Shabbos with speech. Lots of things in Yiddishkeit happen through speech. They are actualized through speech. You see the power that speech has. The Mishnah Berurah in Hilchos Shabbos Reish Nun says that it's good when a person buys things for Shabbos to say Zeu lichvod Shabbos. It's for covered Shabbos. It's for Shabbos. Ki hadibur poyel harbe b'kedusha. Because the words that are spoken will achieve a lot in kedusha. So you see it both ways. We've seen from Chazal the negative. Person speaks lashon hara, unfortunately, it can cause destruction. Person doesn't take care of his speech, calls him midas rois, etc. Mitzad sheni, speech has a tremendous power. Just by speaking something out, you bring it into existence in a very, very unique way. Well, up to the fifth point, I want to say 7 points. Up to the fifth point of Rav Aaron Kotler. The fifth point he says about the power of speech is that the main fulfillment of the mitzvah of learning Torah is through speech. We've had, ever since Har Sinai, but more so with Torah Shebaal Peh, Torah has been passed from generation to generation, from Rebbe to Talmud. How? Through speech. Yeah, it's true. We've been allowed to write down Torah Shebaal Peh, otherwise Torah would have been forgotten, but it's a b'diavad. The Lechatchila was, and still is, for a person to learn through speech. And Rav Aaron Kotler quotes Chazal that say, when a person learns Torah, he should make sure to say the words out loud. Because the main mitzvah of learning Torah is through speech. And I was just thinking, it's particularly relevant to those of us who listen to a shir, let's say a shir Gemara or something, and often it's the case that the Maggid will say it all, and we'll sit there listening. It's important that we try and make an effort to also say the words. Now, whether we say it alongside the Maggid or we say it afterwards in Chazorah, it doesn't matter. But the key point is that you should engage in learning of Torah through speech, because that's the main mitzvah of Torah. In fact, as Rav Aaron Kotler points out, in the morning we are mechuyev to say Berchas HaTorah before we start learning Torah. But if you think thoughts of Torah, you're not mechuyev yet to say the bracha. You're only mechuyev to say Berchas HaTorah when you're about to speak words of Torah. But to think words of Torah, that doesn't require you. What do you see from there? The main mitzvah of learning Torah is through speech. So if you're engaging in the mitzvah of Torah, use your speech. Says Rav Aaron Kotler, point number 6, which the Chofetz Chaim in places also make a similar point, and I believe the Chofetz Chaim brings it from the Zohar, which is that when a person misuses their speech, they cause a tumah, a koach tumah, which then in turn affects the kedusha that follows. So the person speaks lashon hara, and following that they go and learn Torah. So they think themselves, oh, very ecstatic, I'm learning Torah. Now, I'm not saying a person should beat themselves up and say, listen, I'm screwed up anyway. I might as well not do anything else good. Chas v'shalom, I'm not saying that should be the approach at all. It's for a different topic, for a topic of tshuva. But at least when we get to this particular point, The point that's being made is you should just know that the negative speech that you did affects even the good things that you do. And therefore that leads us to the seventh point Rav Aaron Kotler brings from the Kadakemach. The Kadakemach says, the advice he gives is that a person should approach speaking in a similar fashion to how they approach spending their money. In other words, in the same way that a person, generally speaking, I think, tries to be a bit sparing with spending money, a person is a bit more thought through with spending money, so too a person should approach speech in that fashion. Don't have to speak. Don't have to have an opinion and articulate it and get involved in a conversation or whatever it is and always say something. Silence is golden, as we say in English. There is a koach, there is a beauty, there's a value to a person not engaging in speech. I heard this week a story of a guy who was involved in a situation with two other people, and it got very tense between the two other people that were with him. There were words exchanged. He managed to diffuse it, and the tension dissipated, and the conversation resumed, and he went to bed that night happy that he had managed to make shalom. In the middle of the night, he happened to wake up 3 a.m. and made the silly mistake of checking his phone. And he'd received an email. And the email was from one of the people who was in that conversation who felt very slighted, subject to all sorts of verbal accusations by the other guy. And this person had emailed the middleman, fuming, absolutely fuming. You should have stood up for me, you should have defended me, terrible job that you did, etc. To his credit, the guy in the middle, the middleman, did not respond at 3 a.m. to the email in immediate reaction, as one might want to do. He said, I'll wait. He went back to sleep. In the morning, he went back to his phone, and there was a follow-up email. And the follow-up email was from the same guy, and he said, you did an excellent job yesterday. Thank you so much for saving the situation. Just ignore my last email. And just imagine, had he replied in rage to the first email, right? Silence is golden. You don't always have to engage. And the truth is, it's a Mishnah in Avos. The Mishnah in Avos, Aleph Yud Zayin, says as follows: Shimon benoi Omer, Shimon the son of Rabban Gamliel says, Kol Yomai Gidalti ben Chachomim, I spent all my time growing up with the Chachomim, v'lemotzotzi laguf toiv elosh stika. I found shtika, silence, to be the best thing for the person's body. The Mishnah says something else, and then the Mishnah ends off, and someone who increases words, that means they talk, they prattle endlessly, they're going to bring chet. You know, it's very interesting. If you look through the al-chaitz, there are quite a number, disproportionately, there's quite a number of al-chaitz that we say just regarding speech. We say it in different ways, but essentially there's quite a number of them. Marabed dvarim mevi chet. It's the fact. Now, Rabbeinu Yonah says, what the Mishnah is teaching us is not that a person shouldn't engage with negative speech, a person shouldn't speak Lashon Hara. He said, obviously, that's poshut. What the Mishnah is telling you is, even with neutral things, even with things that are dvarim shel ma'bekach, he says, Rabbeinu Yonah says, Kamishim adaber ba'asokov, you're talking about your parnosa, your business. Even then, a person shouldn't just go on and on. A person should have the self-restraint to hold themselves in check and not just to speak without thought. There's a famous non-Jewish Christian phrase which goes like this: sticks and stones may break my bones, but words never hurt me. And it is absolute rubbish, it is nonsense, and it's against the Torah as well. What we've been laying out today is the koyach, the power that we have to speak, and the difference that it does make. The one in Vav Metzir on Chesam Beis says, Godel oinoas devorim me oinoas momin. It's worse for a person to chepper someone else with speech than it is to cause damage in his property. Because the Gemara says different pshatim, but damage with property can be returned. You can be repaid, it can be corrected. When you upset somebody, it's much harder, not so simple. And the flip side of, as we've said all along, the flip side of the negative stuff is the positive stuff. The amount of what you can accomplish with mere words is phenomenal. There's a guy, my father told me years ago, there's a guy who was not from, who ended up one night in Kol Nidre night, he ended up in Shul. And he was stayed for a bit for the service, and he heard the Rav speak, and the rabbi said whatever he said, but what his message or his words that he used was something along the lines of, what exactly are we doing here today? Those are the words he used. And when the man left the shul that night, unfortunately he went back to his car and he got on to drive off. He's thinking to himself, those words of the Rebbe were ringing in his ear. What are we doing here? What tack am I doing here? And that was a trigger point that began for him his journey back. My father said to me, today he's the head of Deiris Yishorim Mevoirachim. He has plenty good family. You'll never believe his background if I told you who it was. That was the lashon my father said to me. In other words, he made a good turn, right? From what? From a drasha, from a Rav. From one sentence. That's all it was. Obviously we never know. He might still not know. But the point is the power that we have with our speech. And I want to leave you with a very powerful story. But just to recap before I do that, what we've said today is the Rashi brings on the Pasuk Liyachal Dvorei that a person should make sure Lo Yaseh Dvorei Chulin. A person should make sure that his words shouldn't be insignificant. Words matter. We spoke through 7 points from Rav Aaron Kotler. Speech is precious because it goes to the essence of the person's existence in this world, like the Targum says, Ruach Memalelo. Speech is an expression of the Ruach of the person, which goes to what Bechira is about. We said that Chet with speech is very chomo. Obviously, Lashon Hara being the cause of Sin Aschinon, Korban Beis HaMikdash. We said speech affects the inner growth and development and midas of a person. We said the main fulfillment of Torah is through speech. The misuse of speech causes a tumah, which then affects the kedusha that comes after it. And finally, from Kadakemach, silence is golden. Speak as if you're spending money, and more thought through about that. Here's the story, Rabbi Say. It's a cracking story. A few years ago, I saw a Tisha B'Av. We call them audio-visual presentations. A Tisha B'Av film, which was called One Split Second, and it was describing the swift destruction of the once glorious and aristocratic Hungarian Jewry. And there was a survivor who was obviously an old person who said over this story that he himself experienced. It was just after the Germans had invaded and the Yidden were being deported. He was informed one day that his Rebbe, the Munkatcher Rebbe, had been taken to the train. In great urgency, he ran to the train to try and see if he could catch his Rebbe, see if he could what he could do to help him. And he started calling out as he approached the first carriage, Munkatcher Rebbe, Munkatcher Rebbe. Second carriage, third carriage. He went past 50 carriages, 50 carriages. And finally the Rebbe's face appeared at the window of the 50th carriage. And the devoted Chassid calls through the window as the train's about to leave, Oi, Rebbe, Rebbe. He gave him $1,000. Huge amount of money. $1,000 at the time. He managed to give him $1,000 through the window. He said, take it, you should try and survive with it. The last few seconds he had with his Rebbe, he asked him one question. He said, Rebbe, why did Hashem need the Kiddush Hashem of all these Yidden to go and die? The Munkatcher Rebbe looked at this Chassid and said, Nein, this is not a Kiddush Hashem. He said, of course, all the Yidden who are being killed are Kedoshim. They're holy people, but they died without having a choice. You know what Kiddush Hashem is? Munkatcher Rebbe looked at this guy's eyes and he said to him, after the war, when you survive, and you've lost everything, and yet with conviction, you say, Ani ma'amin b'emunah shalema, you stick to your yadus despite everything, that's the Kiddush Hashem. This was the parting message that the Munkatcher Rebbe gave this fellow. And as on this video, as he's recording this story as an old man, the tears, he's wiping away tears on his face and he says, it was these words of the Munkatcher Rebbe that brought me back to Yiddishkeit after the war. The power of a few words. One never knows the impact that one can have, both on a positive and a negative. Hashem should give us the koyach. We should live taka and create a Kiddush Hashem in our lives. We should be ma'amin and be zoicha to binyan Beis HaMikdash b'karov.